Today's memory is all about heroes. Now, we can all name heroes right off the top of our head. We've got our military personnel, we've got our firefighters, we've got our police officers, so many that are doing these wonderful things for us every single day. But sometimes I think I forget, and many of us forget, that we have family members who do heroic things every day. One of those stories I want to tell you about has to do with my father, my nieces and nephews' grandfather. I'm hoping that my niece Yolanda and nieces and nephews that were around at that time will remember this story about how my dad pulled little Yolanda out of some pretty thick mud. We had one of those seasons in the spring where it just rained and rained and rained. And you know, in Oklahoma, when it rains, it doesn't just rain for a few minutes. It can go on for an hour or longer and just really pour. And we had several of those rains that spring. We also had a little bit of rain early in the summer. By midsummer, the grass was green, it was warm, it was just a beautiful day to be outside playing. And Mom and Dad had told us older kids to watch the younger kids, not to let them go into the garden. Now, there was this garden in our backyard that was in between the end of our grassy area in the backyard and our cousin the Evans' backyard. And it was out by what used to be an old orchard of cherry trees and at the end of the clothesline that I told you about in my laundry story. Anyway, this garden hadn't been planted yet, and it was just muddy. I mean, the rains had just washed down and made this just solid, almost like frosting on a cake, muddy area. It looked solid. It looked like you could walk on it. But I guarantee you, in this story, you'll see that it was nothing but like quicksand mud. Anyway, like I said, we were told, us big kids, to watch the little kids as they were playing with this plastic ball. They were playing a kind of soccer, just kicking it back and forth. And Dad said, "You big kids, watch them. Don't let them go into the garden." Well, they were doing a pretty good job, and we were doing a pretty good job of watching them. And all of a sudden, someone kicked the ball into this garden area. Now, my niece Yolanda was probably 4 years old. Her nephew Kenneth was probably 5, and that would make my brother Floyd Jr. probably 6 years old. And then there was also April. She was somewhere in there between Kenneth and Yolanda in age. And they were all playing along with some of the nieces and nephews from the cousin side of the family. Anyway, we told them to all just stop. Don't move. We will get the ball. You know, it's one of those light plastic balls that you buy from the TG&Y. Remember the TG&Y? It's kind of like the precursor of Walmart. Anyway, it was a real light ball, so it just rolled onto that muddy garden and didn't sink or anything. So we told them, be still, stay here. We'll go get a rake and we will get it back. Well, we went and got a rake, and we kept trying to reach. We couldn't reach far enough. So, you know, being the smart kids we were, we said, we'll get a stick, we'll tape it onto the rake, and we'll be able to pull it back. While we're looking for all of that, Yolanda decides, remember, she's 4 years old, I believe. She decides that she is going to run out there and get the ball. Now, Yolanda, my niece Yolanda, was my sister Barbara's oldest child. And she was always into something. She was the cutest thing, as you can see by this picture here. Just adorable. She went running across this muddy garden area. And, you know, now it reminds me of, you ever heard of that Jesus lizard? I think there's an appropriate name for it, but it's the lizard that can run across the water real fast. That's what she reminded me of. She ran right across, didn't sink one bit, until she stopped to pick up the ball. When she stopped running across that muddy field, she began to sink so slowly, just sink. And her poor little skinny little legs, not even as big as my arm, just skinny little legs just went straight down in that mud. And poor baby, she started screaming. We all started screaming and everything. And the more she moved, the more she began to sink. Well, here comes my dad. And he's like, what you youngins got yourselves into now, And he's just as calm as he can be. And when my dad would take a step, it would be one step for him and like 5 steps for me. He had a long stride, and he was about, I don't know, 6'2", 6'3", 6'4", I don't know. He was a tall man and very long legs. And he was big and muscular. And so here he came just walking calmly. And he's like, what are you doing in that garden? I told you to keep the kids out of the garden. And poor Yolanda sitting there going, Grandpa, Grandpa. And she's just so scared. So here's Dad. He doesn't even think twice about it. He starts walking. And of course, as he starts walking into the mud, he begins to sink. But for him, it was no big deal. He just lifted one boot after the other, got over there and picked her up. By the time he got to her to pick her up, he was almost up to his knees in that mud. That is how just like quicksand it was. And I'll never forget Yolanda, as he reached for her with one hand and just picked her up out of the mud, and the mud was just falling off her legs. She wrapped her hands around Daddy's neck so tight. I thought she was going to choke him to death. She was holding on so tight. Little tears just rolling down. And Daddy, with the other hand, just gave the ball a hit, and it came rolling up on the yard. And we were all just standing there crying because we thought poor Yolanda is going to sink in this mud. And he struggled a little getting out of that mud. But by the time he got out, there was Yolanda halfway, waist mud. And there he was up to his knees in mud. He sets her down on the ground. He says, somebody get the hose and wash this baby off, like that. And she's like, oh, Grandma, I'm so scared. I was so scared. And he goes, I know. And he goes, the big kids were supposed to be watching out for you, kind of giving us that look. I halfway expected him to say, and Donna Kay, you should have known better. I wasn't the oldest one out there, but I almost expected that. But I remember after washing her off and Daddy taking the hose and washing it off of his jeans and everything, I just stood there and looked at him for a while, and I thought, this man can do anything. He can do anything. And so then he looks at us big kids, and he says, why don't you take the little kids around the front and play in the front? Because y'all can't keep them out of the yard. So I'll never forget that. How scared Yolanda was, how scared we all were, and how calm Daddy was to just pick her up. He was my hero that day, and I really think he was Yolanda's hero too. So that's my first story about my dad and Yolanda and the mud.